Chapter 121 Trying to Escape from Him. No, Mia cried. He dropped the phone and started running toward her. Without thinking, she bolted around her side of the car, yanking her door open and diving across the front seat. She quickly slapped at the lock on the passenger door before he could enter, but it was too late. He had already grabbed the door, pulled it open, and grabbed her wrist from the passenger side. With a strength born out of pure terror, Mia managed to yank her arm free from his grip and threw herself sideways through her open door. She hit the ground on her hip and felt the sharp pain rush through her, but she ignored it and scrambled to her feet. She started running, her feet sliding on the slippery snow, and began screaming for someone to help, knowing there was no one around to hear her because of the deserted road she had driven to. Neil caught her before she could run far and yanked her around, then backed her against the car, trapping her against the side of the BMW. "Hold still and shut the fuck up. Take my car," Mia cried. "Take it and leave me here. I won't tell the authorities anything about meeting you," she cried out, trembling out of fear. Images of her mother's lifeless body kept flashing in her mind, making her struggle even harder to get free from him. Ignoring her, Neil looked over his shoulder at his map that had blown against a trash container 14 feet away when she dropped it. As if in slow motion, Mia watched him remove a shiny black object from his pocket and pointed at her while he backed toward the map and picked it up. A gun. Lord in heaven, he had a gun. He was going to kill her like he did to her mother. Her entire body began to tremble uncontrollably while she listened, in a kind of hysterical disbelief, to the podcast host's voice as she said, "Neil Weiner is believed to be armed and he is mentally ill and very dangerous. If seen, his whereabouts should be reported immediately to the authorities. Citizens should not attempt to approach him. A second escaped convict, Kai Martinez, has been caught and taken into custody." Mia's knees threatened to buckle as she watched him coming toward her with a gun in one hand and the map and directions blowing from his other hand. She had known 5 years ago that he was mentally unstable when it was announced after his imprisonment. They had said he killed without awareness. And those thoughts only made her more scared than ever. Looking at him, she recalled the last time she had been with him 5 years ago. She had seen bloodstains on his shirt and had worried that he was injured, but he had told her that it wasn't his blood. He had gone to kill her mother and the 2 students, and she'd laid beside him that night and allowed him to kiss and touch her. He was a bloody murderer, and he would kill her just like he had her mother if she dared try to run. As Mia was trembling and staring at the gun he pointed at her, a car's headlights crested the hill a quarter of a mile away from them. He slid the gun back into his pocket to keep it out of sight, but he kept his hand there with it. "Get into the car," he ordered sternly. Mia flashed a look over her left shoulder at the approaching car, frantically calculating the impossible odds of outrunning a bullet or even being able to attract the notice of the vehicle's driver before Neil shot her down. "Don't try it," he warned in a low, deadly voice that immobilized her. Her heart thundering against her ribs, she watched as the car drove away at the crossroads, but she didn't dare disobey his order. Not here, not yet. Instinct warned her that this deserted stretch of road was too isolated to succeed in anything but getting killed. She would be shot down before she could escape him. "Start moving." He took her arm and pulled her towards the open door on the driver's side. Cloaked in the deepening dusk of the snowy winter evening, Mia Harrison walked unsteadily beside a murderer who was holding a gun on her. She had the chilling sensation they were both living a scene from the bestseller movie of the year where the hostage got killed trying to escape her kidnapper. Her hands shook so violently she had to grope for the keys in the ignition, and when she tried to start the car, she nearly flooded the engine because even her legs were jerking with fright. Neil watched her unemotionally from the passenger seat. "Drive," he snapped when the engine was started. Mia managed to turn the car around and guided it to the end of the filling station parking lot, but she stopped at the main road, her mind so paralyzed with terror that she couldn't think of the words to ask the obvious question. "I said drive," he snapped impatiently again. Which way?" she cried, hating the timid, pleading sound of her voice and loathing the animal beside her for making her experience this uncontrollable terror. She hated him so much she wished he would drop dead at this moment. She hated him so much she wished she could take the gun from his hand and blow off his head. "Drive back the way we came," he instructed calmly this time. "Be back the way?" Her eyes widened. "You heard me, little one." She didn't argue. She just pressed harder on the gas and turned the car around to go back the way they came. But the traffic was slow because of the snow near the city. Inside the car, the tension and silence were suffocating. Trying desperately to calm her rampaging nerves while she watched for some chance to escape, Mia lifted her shaking hand and tapped the screen of her car's infotainment system to play some music, fully expecting the man beside her to order her not to do it. When he said nothing, she turned it on. A moment later, the car was filled with the melancholy sound of Olivia Rodrigo's song, Traitor. While the music played, Mia looked around at the occupants of the other cars close to hers in the traffic. The man in the car beside hers seemed to be listening to a song as well, his fingers tapping on the steering wheel, keeping time with the melody. He glanced her way, saw her looking at him, and nodded sociably, then he returned his gaze to the front. She knew he hadn't seen anything abnormal in her car, because everything looked perfectly normal to him, and if he were sitting where she was in the BMW, it would have seemed perfectly normal. Olivia Rodrigo's song was playing in the background, just like normal, and the expressway was crowded with cars who were eager to get home, just like normal, and the snow was beautiful, just like normal. Everything was normal, except for one thing. An escaped murderer was sitting in the seat beside her, holding a gun on her and forcing her to drive him to who knows where. It was the cozy normalcy of appearances contrasted against the insane reality of her situation that suddenly snapped Mia from her paralysis to action. She had to do something. She couldn't let him force her into driving him away. She had to take him back to right where he belonged, the prison. Traffic began to move, and her desperation gave birth to inspiration. They had already passed several cars stuck in ditches on both sides of the road by accident. Mia thought she could make it seem like they were skidding to the right, then suddenly turn left, aiming for the ditch. This way, her door might stay accessible while his could get stuck. She wasn't sure if it would work with the BMW's four-wheel drive, though. Beside her, Neil noticed her gaze flick repeatedly to the side of the road. He could sense her mounting panic and knew that fear was going to drive her to try something desperate at any moment. If he were to tell her gently to drive him to his destination, she would surely not listen unless he used his way. "Relax," he ordered. Mia's capacity for fear suddenly reached its limits, and her emotions turned crazily from terror to fury. "Relax," she raged in a shaking voice, whipping her head around and glaring at him. "How in heaven's name do you expect me to relax when you're sitting there with a gun aimed at me? You tell me that." She had a point, Neil thought, and before she attempted something else that might actually get him captured, he decided that helping her to relax was in both of their best interests. "Just take a deep breath and stay calm," he instructed. Mia stared straight ahead, ignoring him. The traffic was thinning out slightly, picking up some speed, and she began to calculate the possibility of ramming her car into the cars around her in an attempt to cause a major pileup. Such an action would cause the police to be summoned. That would be very good. But she and the other innocent people involved in the collision would likely end up being shot by the monster next to her. That would be very bad. Mia was wondering if his gun was loaded and whether he would actually massacre helpless people if she tried to bring attention to him when she heard him say in a calm, condescending voice that adults use on stubborn children. "Nothing will happen to you, Mia. Just follow my instructions and you'll be fine. I need a ride to the mountains, and you have a car. It's that simple. Unless this car is so precious to you that you are willing to risk your life to remove me from it, all you need to do is drive without attracting any attention. If the authorities spot us, there will be shooting, and you'll be caught in the crossfire. So, be cooperative and stay calm." "If you want me to relax," she responded defiantly, ignoring the fact that he had used her first name for the first time, causing a momentary flutter in her heart, "then let me hold that gun, and I'll show you what relaxed means." Seeing his furrowed brows, she almost believed that he genuinely didn't plan to harm her, as long as she didn't interfere with his escape. This realization oddly subdued her fears while simultaneously releasing her pent-up anger at the ordeal he had already subjected her to. Furthermore, she continued angrily, "Don't speak to me like I'm a little child and don't ever call me Mia. I was Miss Harrison to you when I thought you were a respectable man in need of a job, who had purchased those new clothes to impress your employer. If it weren't for those new clothes of yours, I wouldn't have offered you a lift and landed myself in this mess." To her dismay, tears pricked at Mia's eyes, so she shot him a look she hoped conveyed her disdain, then stared fixedly ahead through the windshield while fighting back the choking emotions in her throat. She hated him so much for making her go through such an emotional roller coaster. Oh, Lord in heaven, help her get out of this mess. Chapter 122 In Attempt to Make Amends. Neil lifted his brows and regarded her in impassive silence, but inwardly, he was stunned and reluctantly impressed by her unexpected show of courage. She was scared of him, and yet she was trying her best not to show her weakness. He knew what he was doing was wrong, but at this point in his life, there was no right or wrong in his book. He didn't want to terrify her, but if he didn't do it this way, there was no way she would drive him to his destination. And if he chose to let her go after she had seen where he was going, then he would be giving himself away. Turning his head, he looked at the traffic opening up ahead of them and at the thick, falling snow that had seemed like a curse a few hours ago, but had actually diverted the attention of the policemen who had to deal with stranded drivers before they could begin to search for him. Last, he considered the stroke of luck that had put him not in the car arranged for him, but in a fancy BMW 7 that could easily navigate in the snow without getting stuck on the less traveled route he intended to take up into the mountains. With her car, it would be easier for them to reach the mountains in time. All of the complications that had infuriated him for the last few hours had now turned out to be bonuses, he realized. He was going to make it to the mountains, all thanks to his beautiful Mia Harrison. Miss Harrison, he corrected himself with an inner smirk as he relaxed back in his seat. She had warned him not to address her by her name again, and he would do anything she wanted as long as she wouldn't jeopardize his escape plans. Neil's flash of amusement suddenly vanished as quickly as it had come, because there was something about the news of his escape he'd heard earlier that was beginning to worry him now. Kai Martinez had been referred to as another escaped prisoner who was caught and taken into custody. If Kai had stuck to the plan, then Jason should have been crowing to the media about the loyalty of one of the prisoners rather than referring to Kai as another escaped prisoner. He hoped as hell the boy hadn't messed up and tried to escape as well. He had seen the excitement in his blue eyes at the thought of escaping prison. He wouldn't be able to live with himself if Kai were to remain in prison for longer than he should because of his escape plans. Neil told himself that the information on the podcast had simply been jumbled, which accounted for the mistake about Kai, and he forced himself to concentrate on the irate young woman beside him instead. Although he desperately needed her and her car right now, she was also a serious complication to his plans. She knew he was heading for the mountains. Moreover, she might have seen enough of that map and the directions with it to be able to tell the authorities the vicinity of his hideaway. If he left her at the state border or a little further north, she'd be able to tell the authorities where he was going and exactly what kind of car he was driving as well. By now, his face was already plastered all over every television screen in the country, so he couldn't possibly hope to rent or buy another car without being recognized. Furthermore, he wanted the military to believe he'd managed to fly out of the country. Mia seemed to be both a heaven-sent and a disastrous kink in his plans. She hated him to the core, and he couldn't think of any way to make her trust him at this point. Thus, rather than curse fate for saddling him with her and the deadly threat to his freedom that she represented, he decided to give fate an opportunity to work out this problem and to try to help them both relax. Reaching beside him, he took out the flask of coffee he had seen her keep before they started their journey at the restaurant. The flask felt warm in his hand. He thought back to her last remarks and came up with what seemed like a good conversational opening to make her relax in his company. In a carefully offhand, non-threatening tone, he inquired, "What's wrong with my clothes?" She gaped at him in blank confusion. "Ooh, what? You said something about my clothes being the only reason you offered me a ride," he explained, pouring the coffee from the flask into a small straw cup he found in the bottle holder of her car. "What's wrong with the clothes?" Mia swallowed a hysterical surge of angry laughter. She was concerned about her life, and he was concerned about making a fashion statement. Was he out of his mind, or was he just trying to get on her nerves by starting a pointless conversation with her? He was the last person on earth she wanted to see or even talk to, but he was here trying to act like everything was fine. "What?" he repeated, determined to make her speak to him. "Did you mean?" He didn't like the hate he saw in her eyes every time she glanced at him, nor did he like that she was ignoring his presence. Mia was on the verge of an angry retort when two things occurred to her at once. It was insane to deliberately antagonize an armed man, and if she could make him relax his guard by indulging in small talk with him, her chances to either escape or get out of this alive would be vastly improved. Trying to inject a polite, neutral tone into her voice, she drew a long breath and said without taking her eyes from the road, "I noticed your clothes were brand new." She muttered softly while fighting down her hatred. Neil raised an eyebrow. "What did that have to do with your deciding to offer me a ride?" he asked. Bitterness at her own gullibility filled Mia's voice. Since you didn't have a car and you implied you didn't have a job, I assumed you must be having a hard time financially. Then you said you were hoping to get a new job, and I noticed the crease in your trouser." Her voice trailed off when she realized with a disgusted jolt that instead of the nearly destitute man she'd thought him to be, he was actually one of the richest men in their country, and was also the man she had hated to the bones for killing the only family she had in the world. "Go on," he prodded, his voice tinged with puzzlement and curiosity. "I jumped to the obvious conclusion, for heaven's sake. I figured you had bought new clothes so you could make a good impression on your employer, and I imagined how important that must have been to you while you were buying them in the store and how much hope you must have been feeling when you bought them, and I couldn't bear the thought that your hope was going to be trashed if I didn't offer you a ride. So even though I've never picked up a hitchhiker in my life, I couldn't stand to see you miss having your chance in life." Neil was not only stunned, he was unwillingly touched. Kindness like hers, a kindness that also required some kind of personal risk or sacrifice, had been absent from his existence for all the years he'd spent in prison. And even before that, he realized. Pushing the unsettling thought aside, he said, "You envisioned all that from a crease in my trouser? You've got one hell of an imagination, Miss Harrison," he added with a sardonic shake of his head. "I'm obviously a bad judge of character, too," Mia said bitterly as she remembered how much she'd trusted him in the past and how he'd broken not just her heart but soul. From the corner of her eye, she saw his left arm swing toward her and she instinctively jumped, muffling a scream as she thought he was going to hit her before she realized he was only holding out a cup of coffee from her flasks. Neil, who noticed her actions, frowned at the realization that Mia still had her trauma of being frightened whenever he raised his hands. Just like in the past. In a quiet tone that almost seemed to carry an apology for adding to her fright, Neil said, "I thought this might help you relax." Mia glared heatedly at him, then said, "I'm not interested in having anything go through my stomach, thanks to you." "Drink a little anyway," Neil ordered, determined to ease her terror even while he knew his presence was the source of it. "It will." He hesitated, feeling at a loss for words on how to make her feel at ease in his presence like she used to in the past, and added, "It will make things seem more normal between us." Mia turned her head and gaped at him, her expression making it clear she found his concern for her not only completely revolting, but insane. She was on the verge of telling him that, but she remembered the gun in his pocket, so she took the coffee in a shaking hand and turned away from him, sipping it and staring at the road ahead while trying her best to ignore him. Beside her, Neil watched the telltale trembling of the coffee cup as she raised it to her lips, and he felt a ridiculous urge to apologize for terrifying her like this. She had a lovely profile, he thought, studying her face in the light of the road lamps that split inside the car as they drove under them. Though she had changed from the Mia he knew before he was sent to prison, she still looked the same in some ways, with her small nose and stubborn little chin. She still had her magnificent eyes, he thought, thinking of the way they'd shot sparks at him a few minutes ago. Spectacular eyes. He felt a sharp stab of guilty shame for using and frightening this innocent girl who'd been trying to help a man in need. And because he had every intention of continuing to use her, he felt like the monster everybody believed he was. To silence his conscience, he resolved to make things as easy on her as he possibly could, which led him to decide to engage her in further conversation rather than sit in the heated silence of her hatred. He noticed the ring she wore on her finger and felt another jab to his chest. But he ignored it and tried to remember what people, normal people on the outside, talked about for idle conversation, and he finally said, "Have you been doing for the past 5 years?" She turned again, her incredible eyes wide with suppressed hatred. "Do you expect me," she uttered in disbelief, "to engage in polite small talk with you about my life?" "Yes," he snapped, irrationally angry at her reluctance to let him make amends. "I do, so start talking." "Fine. My life has been nothing but miserable, all thanks to you for killing the only family I had in my life." Mia shot back shakily, hating how easily he could intimidate her. She looked away from him, missing the expression of shocked disbelief in his eyes at her words. "I didn't," he began to speak, but Mia cut him off as she didn't want to hear anything from him about her mother's death. "How far do you intend for me to drive you?" she demanded as they passed a sign that said Avalora Border. The mountains he was headed was 30 miles away. "Avalora," Neil said, half truthfully, as he had no intentions of ever letting her go until she would trust him again. Chapter 123 I Believe You. "We're in Avalora." Mia pointed out the instant they drove past the sign announcing they were there. Neil shot her a look of grim amusement. "I see that," he remarked nonchalantly as he relaxed his back on the seat. Mia frowned deeply at his nonchalance. "Well, where do you intend to get out of my car?" "Not yet. Keep driving," he said calmly. "Keep driving to where?" she cried in nervous fury. "Now look, I'm not driving you all the way to the mountains." Neil had his answer. She knew exactly where he was going. "I won't do it," Mia warned shakily, unaware that she had just sealed her fate with the devil. "I can't. I won't," she murmured shakingly while fighting back her tears. With an inner sigh at the battle she was bound to wage, Neil said, "Yes, Miss Harrison, you can." "And you will," he ordered with an unflappable calmness. His unflappable calmness was the last straw on Mia's nerves. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel. "I hope you rot in hell after your death," she cursed while angrily swinging the steering wheel hard to the right before he could stop her, sending the car careening onto the side of the road as she slammed on the brakes and brought it to a lurching stop. "Take the car," she pleaded, desperate to get away from him. "Take it and leave me here. I won't tell anyone I've seen you or where you're going. I swear I won't tell anyone. Please." Neil reined in his temper and tried to soothe her with an attempt at levity, which he'd never tried to do with anyone before he was sent to prison. "When I was a little boy, I watched a movie where the hostage promised those same words to her kidnapper," he remarked conversationally, glancing over his shoulder at the cars roaring past them. "And I thought it sounded stupid. This isn't a movie." She glared at him. "But you do agree that it is an absurd promise," he argued with a slight smile. "You know it is. Admit it, Mia." Shocked that he was apparently trying to tease her as if they were friends, Mia stared at him in furious silence, knowing he was right about the promise being ridiculous, but refusing to admit it or engage in any conversational words with him. "You can't really expect me to believe," he continued, his voice softening a little, "that you'd let me get away with abducting you and stealing your expensive car, and then be so grateful to me for doing both that you'd keep a promise to me you made under extreme duress? Doesn't that sound a little ridiculous to you? Do you expect me to debate psychology with you when my whole life is at stake?" She burst out furiously while glaring at him. "I realize you're afraid, but your life isn't at stake unless you put it there. You aren't in any form of danger unless you create it, little one," he whispered softly. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or the low timbre of his voice, or the steadiness of his gaze, but as Mia looked at his solemn features, she found herself almost believing him and relaxing. "I don't want you to get hurt," he continued, "and you won't, as long as you don't do anything that attracts attention to me and alerts the military." "And if I attract any attention to you," Mia interrupted bitterly, snapping out of her trance, "you will blow my brains out with your gun." "That's very comforting, Mr. Wayner." Neil held his temper in check and explained, "If the military catches up with me, they'll have to kill me, because I'm not going to surrender to them. Given the vigilante mentality of the military, there's a good chance you'll be hurt or killed in the crossfire. I don't want that to happen. Can you understand that, Mia?" Furious with herself for being subdued by empty, gentle words from a ruthless murderer, Mia jerked her gaze from his and stared out the front window. "Do you actually think you can convince me of being a gentleman and not a depraved monster?" "Evidently not," he said irritably. When she refused to look at him again, Neil gave an impatient sigh and said curtly, "Stop being a baby and start driving. I need to find another roadside phone booth to make a call." The moment his voice chilled, Mia realized how foolish she'd been to ignore his friendly overture and annoy him. What she probably ought to be doing, she decided as she pulled back out onto the highway, was fooling him into believing she was resigned to going along with him. At this point, she couldn't escape him, nor could she call for help as he had taken her phone earlier and turned it off. The only way out was to fool him. As the snowflakes danced in front of her headlights, her mind began to calm, and she thought carefully about possible ways out of her predicament, because it now seemed horribly likely that he was going to force her to drive him through Avalora and up to the mountains, when she ought to be at home by now preparing for Christmas with Rain and Owen. Finding a means to foil his plan and get away became not only a necessity, but a downright challenge. To do that, she knew she had to be objective and to keep all traces of fright and hate from clouding her thoughts. She should be able to do that, Mia reminded herself. After all, she had graduated from investigation journalism. She was well versed on how to deceive people and get them to trust you. She would use that to her advantage and escape from him. Chewing on her lower lip, she decided to try to think of her ordeal as if it were merely a plot in one of the novels she loved to read. She'd always felt some of the heroines in those novels behaved with obvious stupidity, which was what she'd been doing by antagonizing her captor, she thought. A clever female lead would do the opposite. She'd be devious and find ways to make Neil relax his guard completely. If he did that, her chances to escape and get him returned to prison where he belonged would be dramatically increased. To accomplish that goal, she could try to pretend she was coming to think of this nightmare as an adventure. Maybe she could even pretend to be on his side, which would require a wonderful performance, but she was willing to try. Despite her grave misgivings about her ability to succeed, Mia suddenly felt a welcome calm and determination sweep through her, banishing her fear and leaving her head clearer. She waited several moments before speaking, so that her surrender wouldn't seem too sudden and suspicious to him. Then she drew a steadying breath and tried to inject a rueful note into her voice. "Mr. Wayner," she called softly, actually managing to cast him a slight, sideways smile. "I appreciate what you said about not intending to hurt me. I didn't mean to be sarcastic. I was afraid, that's all." "And now you aren't afraid?" he countered, his voice laced with skepticism. "Well, yes," Mia hastened to assure him. "You already gave me your word that you won't hurt me if I don't interfere with your plans. May I inquire what brought about this sudden transformation in you? What were you thinking about while you were so quiet a moment ago?" he asked suspiciously. "A novel," she said, because it seemed safe. "A mystery novel. One you've read, or one you're thinking about writing?" He raised a questioning brow. Her mouth opened, but no words came out, and then she realized he'd unknowingly handed her the perfect means to his own defeat. "You see, when I graduated from Ivy Grove, I've always wanted to write a mystery novel someday," she muttered softly, "and it occurred to me now that this could be, well, first-hand research with you." "I see," he drawled while staring at her as if to search her expression for any lies, but when he found none, he relaxed a bit. Mia darted another glance at him and was startled by the warmth of a smile she found on his face. This devil could charm a snake, she realized, recalling that same rare smile from the past. Back then she would give anything to see him smile at her, but now she would give anything to make sure he never smiled again. "You are a remarkably brave young woman, Mia." She choked back her irate demand to be called Miss Harrison and forced a convincing, genuine smile. "Actually, I'm the world's greatest coward, Mr. My name is Neil," he interrupted, and in his impassive tone, she sensed a return of his suspicion. She couldn't give herself away and had to keep pretending. If it were before, she would be over the moon by the thought of meeting Neil Wayner in person. "Neil," she hastily agreed. "You're quite right. We ought to use first names now, since we're apparently going to be together for." She looked at him for an answer. "Quite a while," he provided, and Mia made a huge effort to conceal her frustrated fury at his curt reply. "Quite a while," she agreed, careful to keep her tone neutral. "Well, that's probably long enough for you to help me with some research about my novel," she hesitated, thinking of what to ask him. "Would you, well, consider giving me some insight into what prison is really like and your experience in there? That would be helpful for my novel as I plan to make my male lead an ex-con." "Would it?" He was scaring the hell out of her with the subtle, ever-changing differences in his voice. Never before had she known a man or woman who could convey so much with imperceptible changes in his voice, nor had she heard a voice like his in her life. It had a rich, deep-toned timbre that could switch instantly and unaccountably from polite to amused to icy and ominous. He was never like this before, or perhaps she'd never viewed him as a dangerous man then? In answer to his question, Mia nodded vigorously, trying to counteract his skeptical tone by injecting energy and conviction into her own. "Absolutely." An idea suddenly flashed to her mind. She realized that if he thought she was on his side, he'd be even more likely to lower his guard. "I've heard that a lot of innocent people get sent to prison. Were you innocent of the murders?" she asked, her fingers tightening around the steering wheel. "Every convicted murderer claims he's innocent." "Yes, but are you?" she persisted, dying for him to say he was so she could pretend to believe him. "The judge said I was guilty of killing them, and guilty of allowing the bomb to explode when I could defuse it. Judges have been wrong before. 20 well-skilled investigators, and 4 attorneys," he replied in a voice suddenly iced with loathing, "decided I was guilty. I'm sure they tried to be objective. Damn them," he said so furiously that Mia's hands tightened on the steering wheel under a fresh rush of fear and dread. They convicted me of being rich and famous, he snapped. I watched their faces during the trial, and the more the bastard attorneys blabbered about my privileged life, the more the citizens of the country wanted my blood. The whole damned military, soldiers I trained, turned their backs on me when I needed them. A bunch of them knew there was a reasonable doubt I didn't commit those murders, and they knew I defused that bomb years ago, and that's why they didn't recommend a death penalty to me. They didn't give me a chance to find the culprit and prove myself before they sent me to that hellhole of a prison. Mia felt the perspiration break out on her palms at the rage in his voice that sent cold shivers down her spine. Now, more than ever before, she realized how important it was to make him believe she sympathized with him. It had been said that he was mentally unstable and had committed those murders in a state of unawareness, which meant he would surely believe he didn't do it, and when she pretended to believe him, he would trust her. But you weren't guilty, were you? You just couldn't prove who really committed the murder, is that it? She asked in a trembling voice. What difference does it make? He snapped. It makes a difference to me because I believe you didn't do it. For a moment, he studied her in frozen silence, and then his voice made one of its abrupt, compellingly soft turns. If it truly makes a difference to you, then no, I didn't commit any of those crimes. He was lying, of course. He had to be, as he was mentally ill. Mia convinced herself. I believe you. Trying to heap more reassurances on him, she added, and if you are innocent, then you have every right to try to escape from that prison. His answer was an uncomfortably long silence during which she felt his piercing gaze examining every feature on her face. Then he said abruptly, the sign said there's a phone booth up ahead. Pull over when you see it. He then looked away from her. Chapter 124. I've been kidnapped by a convicted murderer. The glass phone booth was beside the road, and Mia pulled off onto the side. She was watching the outside rearview mirror in hopes of seeing a vehicle she could flag down, but the cars were all speeding away in a flash. Neil's voice made her snap her head around just as he pulled her car keys from the ignition. I'm hoping, he said in a sardonic voice, you won't think I doubt your word about believing I'm innocent and wanting to see me escape. I'm simply taking the car keys because I happen to be a very cautious man. He flashed her a harmless smile. Mia amazed herself by managing to shake her head and say convincingly, it's all right, I don't blame you. With another brief smile, he got out of the car, but he kept his hand in his pocket where the gun was, as a deliberate, menacing reminder to her, and he left the passenger door open, undoubtedly so he could see what she was doing while he made his call. Knowing she wouldn't be able to outrun him and a possible bullet, Mia had no hope of escaping right now, but she could start preparing for the future. As he stepped into the snow, she said with all the meekness she could muster, would you mind if I get a pen and paper out of my purse so that I can write down a few notes while you're on the phone? You know, jot down feelings and things so that I can use them in my novel? Before he could refuse, which he looked about to do, she reached cautiously for her purse on the back seat while pointing out reasons he shouldn't deny her request. Writing always calms my nerves, she said, and you can search my purse, if you like. You'll see I don't have another phone or set of keys. To prove it, she opened the Chanel purse and handed it to him to take a look for himself. He gave her an impatient, preoccupied look that made her feel as if he didn't believe her story about writing a novel for a moment and was simply going along with it to keep her docile. All right, he said, handing the Chanel purse back to her. As he turned away, Mia pulled out a small notepad and her pen. Keeping an eye on his back, she watched him pick up the phone and dial some numbers. Then she quickly wrote down a few messages on 2 different slips of paper. I've been kidnapped by a convicted murderer. Help me. From the corner of her eye, she saw him watching her, and she waited until he turned away to talk to whoever he was calling. Then she tore off the first 2 sheets, folded them in half, and tucked them into the small pocket inside her purse where she could easily reach them. She opened the notebook again and stared at it, her mind frantically searching for ways to pass the notes to people who could aid her. Struck with a plausible idea, she stole a glance at him to be sure he wasn't looking. Then she quickly took one of the notes from her purse and folded it into a dollar bill from her purse. She had a plan, Mia thought in relief. She was going to execute it, and the knowledge that she was now taking some control of her future banished much of her lingering fear and panic. However, she suddenly had a strange feeling in her heart. The feeling came from an instinctive but unshakable conviction that one thing Neil Weiner had said was true. He did not want to harm her in any way. Therefore, he wasn't going to shoot her in cold blood. In fact, if she tried to escape now, She was certain he would chase her, but he wouldn't shoot her unless it looked as if she were going to flag down a passing car. Since there were no cars coming, Mia saw no point in opening her door and making a run for it right now, not when he could outrun her, and all she would gain was to put him permanently on his guard and make him never trust her again. Better by far to appear to cooperate and lull him into relaxing as much as possible. Neil Wayner might be an ex-soldier with a high IQ, but she was determined to outsmart him in her own escape, just like he had outsmarted the military prison. She knew it had been said that he was an intelligent man with many talents and skills. He taught himself things normal people would have to study for years to master, like defusing bombs and making weapons. Escaping someone as dangerous as Neil Wayner wasn't going to be easy, but if she concentrated on her plan now, she'd be able to outsmart him, she was absolutely positive. Well, almost positive. So long as she kept her head, she had an excellent chance of winning this contest of wits. Seeing that he was looking at her again while speaking on the phone, she quickly took out her notebook. She began jotting down sweet comments about him in case he asked to see what she'd written. Finished, she reread her absurd commentary. Neil Wayner is fleeing from unjust imprisonment caused by a biased trial. He seems to be an intelligent, kind, warm-hearted man, a victim of circumstances. I believe in him and I believe he committed no crime. The commentary was, she thought with an inner grimace, the worst piece of pure fiction ever written. So engrossed was she that she experienced only a momentary jolt of shock when she realized he had finished his call and was climbing into the car. Quickly closing the notebook and shoving it into her purse, she asked politely, "Did you speak to whoever it is you're trying to call?" His eyes narrowed sharply on her smile, and she had an uneasy feeling she was overdoing her comradely performance. "None of your business." Mia was digesting that curt, useless reply when he reached for her purse and took out her notebook. "Just to be cautious," he said in a sardonic voice as he flipped open the notebook. "You understand, I'm sure?" "Why, yeah, I understand," Mia replied, caught between nervous laughter and embarrassment as she watched his jaw slacken when he read what she had written on the notepad. "So," she asked, widening her eyes with sham innocence, "what do you think?" Neil closed the notebook and slid it back into her purse and gave it back to her. "I think you're too gullible." "I'm very gullible," she eagerly assured him, turning on the ignition and pulling out onto the highway. If he thought her stupid and naive, that was great, terrific. For the next hour, they drove in silence with only a few occasional complaints about the bad weather and worsening driving conditions, but Mia was watching the side of the road for a billboard that would enable her to put her plan into action. Any billboard that advertised a fast food restaurant at an approaching exit would do. When she finally saw one, her heart doubled its beat. "I know you probably don't want us to stop and go into a restaurant, but I'm starving," she said carefully, and at that moment her stomach made a growling noise. "That sign says there's a KFC up ahead. We could get some food at the drive-through window." He glanced at her growling stomach and started to shake his head, as making a stop at a restaurant would delay them, but she hastily added, "I have to eat something every couple of hours because I have." She hesitated a split second, thinking quickly for the right medical term for a problem she didn't have, hypoglycemia. "I'm sorry, but if I don't eat something, I get very sick and I might faint and die of." "Fine, we'll stop there." He cut her off. Mia almost jumped with nervous triumph when she pulled off on the exit ramp and the KFC building came into view. "We're stopping just in time," she said, "because I'm feeling very dizzy that I won't be able to drive much longer." Ignoring his narrowed look, Mia flipped on the turn indicator and drove into the KFC entrance. Despite the storm, there were several cars in the parking lot, though not nearly so many as Mia wished there were, and she could see a few families seated at the tables inside the restaurant. Following the directions on the sign, she drove around behind the restaurant to the drive-through window and stopped at the speaker. "What would you like?" she turned and asked him. Before his imprisonment, Neil wouldn't have stopped at a fast food restaurant like this if he had to go all day without eating. He didn't care about food that much then. He could go a day without having anything but wine. Now he discovered his mouth was watering at the thought of a simple fried chicken and hamburger. Freedom did that, he thought after telling Mia what he wanted to eat. Freedom made the air smell fresher and food sound better. It also made a man more tense and suspicious, because there was something about Mia's overbright smile that was making him extremely wary. She looked so fresh and ingenuous with those big brown eyes and soft smile, but she'd switched much too quickly from a terrified woman to a furious hostage to her current attitude of friendly ally, that was making him doubt if she had some hidden motives. Mia repeated their orders into the microphone. "That'll be $10.05, the voice said over the microphone. "Please drive around to the first window." As she pulled up alongside the first window, she saw Neil dig into his pocket for money, but she shook her head quickly, already reaching into her purse. "I'll pay for it," she said, managing to look straight into his eyes. "It's my treat. I insist." After a moment of hesitation, he took his hand out of his pocket, but his dark brows drew together into a baffled frown. "That's very generous of you. That's me. I'm a very generous person. Everyone always says so," she babbled mindlessly, removing the folded dollar bill with her handwritten note saying that she was being kidnapped folded inside of it. Unable to meet his unnerving gaze any longer, Mia hastily looked away and focused all her attention on the teenage girl in the drive-through window, who was regarding them with bored impatience. "That'll be $10.05, said the girl. Mia held out the money and stared hard at the girl, her face pleading. Her life depended on this bored-looking teenager with curly black hair. As if in slow motion, Mia watched the girl unfold the bill. But the small notepaper floated to the ground. The girl frowned upon noticing the paper. She bent and picked it up, casually popping the gum in her mouth. She straightened up and glanced at Mia. "Is this yours, ma'am?" she asked, holding the paper up, peering into the car without reading what was written on the paper. "I don't think so," Mia said, trying to force the girl to read the words. "It might be, take a look at it." She began, but stifled a scream as Neil's hand suddenly clamped on her arm as he took out his gun and pressed it into her side. "Never mind," he said smoothly to the girl, leaning around Mia and holding out his hand to the girl. "That's my note. I'm just pranking my wife over here." The girl glanced at the note, but it was impossible to tell if she'd actually read it in the instant before she held it in her outstretched hand toward the car. "Here you are, sir," she said, leaning forward past Mia and handing it to Neil with a bright, girlish grin. Chapter 125 Memories of him before. Mia ground her teeth as Neil gave the girl a phony, appreciative smile that made her blush with pleasure as she counted out their change. "Here's your order," said the girl, handing them their food and change. Mia automatically reached for the white bags of food and Cokes, her frightened face silently pleading with the girl to call the authorities or the manager or someone, but the seemingly teenager was too smitten by Neil's charm to notice anything. Mia passed the bags to Neil without daring to meet his gaze, her hands trembling so violently she nearly dropped the Coke cans. She could feel his eyes on her, boring a hole into her, but she tried her best not to look his way and meet those savage gray eyes. As she drove away from the window, she expected some sort of action from him, but since her plan had failed miserably, Mia was not prepared for the eruption of raw rage she heard. "You little troublemaker, are you trying to get yourself killed? Stop the car in the parking lot, right there where the girl can see us. She's looking our way suspiciously." Mia obeyed automatically, her chest rising and falling in sharp, shallow little breaths as she felt the raw rage emitting from him. It was so much so she could barely think or breathe. He brought out the cheeseburger from the bag and unwrapped it. "Eat this," he commanded, shoving it in her face. "And smile with every bite like a happy wife should, or you will face the consequences if that girl calls the authorities." Again, Mia obeyed. She chewed without tasting, every fiber of her being concentrated on calming her shattered nerves so that she could think again. The tension in the car grew very heavy, adding to her strained nerves. She spoke simply to break the silence. "See, can I have my Coke?" she said, reaching for the white bag of drinks on the floor near his feet. But before she could reach it, his hand gripped her wrist with a strength that threatened to break the fragile bones. "Why, you're hurting me," Mia cried, fighting down the rush of panic that swelled inside her at the savage look in his gray eyes. Neil, however, was too consumed by his rage to care that he was hurting her. All he could think about was the fact that she had almost fooled him into trusting her. His hand tightened more painfully before he flung her wrist away as if he didn't want anything to do with her. Mia reared back in her seat, leaned her head back, and closed her eyes, swallowing the huge lump in her throat and rubbing her throbbing arm. Until a few moments ago, he hadn't actually tried to inflict pain on her, and she had deceived herself with the misconception that he wasn't a depraved monster, but rather a man who was mentally ill and was in need of help in the asylum. She had let herself relax enough to want to fool him. She wondered desperately why she had allowed herself to believe that he wouldn't be just as likely to harm her or the innocent teenage girl who could sound an alarm and have him captured. The reason was that she had been deceived and misled by her memories of him. Memories from when he was still a substitute professor, when he had kissed her on the couch in his living room as though she was everything to him, and whispered, "Don't ever let any other man kiss you the way I did. Even if I'm not there, I'll know if you let anyone touch or kiss you. Remember my words, Harrison, I'll kill whoever you let touch you in my absence. You must remain a virgin." She would always remember the man who had uttered those words to her. She had allowed herself to relax, thinking he was still the same person and would never harm her. She had been deceived by memories of Neil Wayner, the glamorous stories about him being a hero in the world's eyes in magazines and on television, memories of numerous nights fantasizing about meeting him. And the most shameful truth was that when he had claimed he was innocent, a part of her believed it might be possible he was telling the truth, as it seemed logical for him to attempt an escape to prove his innocence. For some incomprehensible reason, a tiny part of her still clung to that possibility, probably because it helped her control her fear, but it didn't lessen her desperation to get away from him. Even if he was innocent of the crimes for which he was sent to prison, that didn't mean he wouldn't kill to prevent being sent back there, and that was if he was innocent, a very big, highly unlikely if. Mia's whole body jerked in alarm when the bag on the floor crackled. "Here," he snapped, shoving a Coke toward her hand. Refusing to look at him, Mia stretched her hand out and took it, her gaze remaining on the view through the front windshield. She now realized her only hope of escaping without getting anyone hurt or killed was to make it easier for him to escape in her car and leave her behind, than it was to stick around and try to stop him from escaping. Which meant she had to be out of the car and in full view of onlookers. She had blown her first attempt to escape. He knew now she was desperate enough to try again. He would be waiting, watching. When she tried again, everything would have to be exactly right. She knew somehow she wasn't likely to live to have a third chance. At least there was no further need to carry on any stupid act that she was on his side. "Let's get going," he snapped sternly when she didn't move to start the car. Wordlessly, Mia turned on the ignition and pulled out of the parking lot of the restaurant. Half an hour later, he ordered her to pull over at a roadside phone again, and he made another phone call. He had not spoken a word except to tell her to pull over, and Mia suspected he knew that silence caused more havoc on her nerves than anything else he could do to intimidate her. He was silently punishing her. This time when he made his phone call, he never took his eyes off her. When he got back into the car, Mia looked at his impassive features and couldn't endure the silence another moment. Giving him a haughty glare, she nodded at the phone booth and said, "Terrible news, I hope." Neil bit back an amused grin at the rigid, rebellious look in her eyes. Her pretty face gave out a false, stubborn courage and acid wit that continually caught him off guard. Instead of replying that the news he received from Liam was very good, he shrugged casually. Silence ate at her, he had noticed, and he would continue to give her that silence for her silly attempt earlier. "Start driving," he said, leaning back in his seat and stretching out his legs, idly watching her graceful long fingers on the steering wheel. She had beautiful nails, he noted for the very first time while fighting back the strong urge to hold her slender hands and soothe the red marks around her wrist from his grips on her earlier. He hadn't intended to hurt her, but she had pushed him beyond his limit by trying to get him captured. He had almost fooled himself into believing that his little Mimi, who has now grown into a woman, would understand him out of everyone. He'd almost believed that she believed him, but she was only fooling him just so she could get away. He had spoken to Liam and he had assured him that his decoy, who looked so much like him, was now on the run, heading to the airport. The man would make enough of a nervous spectacle of himself to cause the securities there to remember him. When Neil would still be in the country, those securities should remember his decoy and notify the military that their escaped convict had probably left the country. Within a week, the hunt for Neil Wayner should be mostly centered in other countries, leaving Neil much more freedom to continue with the rest of his plans. For now, for the next weeks, it rather looked as if he had nothing whatsoever to do except relax and revel in his freedom at the mountains. It seemed like a delightful notion and it would have put him rather in peace with the world if it weren't for the troublesome woman beside him. She was the only problem in his relaxation. A very big problem, since she apparently wasn't half so easily subdued as he'd thought she would be. At the moment, she was driving unnecessarily slow and casting angry looks at him and glaring daggers at him. No doubt she wouldn't hesitate to kill him if he were to give her the gun in his hand. "What's the problem?" he asked, gentling his voice to make amends for hurting her earlier. But she snapped at him, The problem is that I need to use a restroom. Not now, he snapped back at her with the same tone she used on him. You can't, she began to argue, but he glared at her then, and Mia realized it was useless to argue with a temperamental psychopath like him. If there was one thing she was grateful for, it was for the fact that he looked different from the man she'd liked 5 years ago. This psychopath beside her had grown a light stubble from not having the time to shave, and those stubbles made it easier for her to view him as another person without meeting his gray eyes. An hour later, they crossed the Avalora state line, with only a few miles to the mountains. And he spoke for the first time. There's a truck stop up ahead. Slow down at the place, and if it looks all right, we'll stop there and you can do your business. However, the truck stop turned out to be too busy to suit him, and it was another half an hour later before he found a filling station that was empty and laid out to please him with no attendants positioned at the pumps. He could pay for the gas without meeting anyone and with restrooms on the outside of the building. You can go to the restroom now, he said as the car stopped in the filling station. Slow down, he warned as she got out of the car and started to run toward the restroom door. But he grasped her elbow as if to help her walk through the snow, his feet crunching the crusty powder in perfect rhythm with hers as he matched her stride for stride. When they reached the restroom, instead of letting go of her arm, he reached out and opened the door for her, and Mia's suppressed anger exploded. You dirty pervert! Do you intend to come in here with me and watch me do my business? She burst out in furious disbelief. Yes, I will if it's the only thing I have to do to keep you from escaping me. He smirked down at her, and she glared up at him. Ignoring her glares, he looked around the tiny restroom, checking for windows, she supposed, and finding none, he let go of her arm. Make it quick. And, Mia, don't do anything stupid in there. Like what? She demanded. Hang myself on the ceiling with toilet paper? Unbelievable. Go to hell. Yanking her arm free, she dashed inside, and when she was about to close the door, an idea suddenly flashed into her mind. She could lock the door from the inside and stay there until someone else came around. With a small triumphant grin, she turned the lock with her fingertips and slammed the door at the same time, throwing her shoulder against it. The door slammed into the jamb with a satisfying thud, but the lock didn't seem to catch, and she had a sudden feeling he was holding the doorknob on the other side to prevent it from locking. From the other side of the door, he twisted the knob, and it turned in her hand at the same time. His tone of amusement told her she was right. You have a minute and a half before I open this door, señorita. Make it quick. Then he smirked, immensely enjoying himself.